It's always good to start the stream and then cough so that everybody hears you cough. Never cough before you start the stream, always after you start it. Anyway, it looks like we got it started. This is Bishop Dennis Eversen here. I'm here with Wen Chen, and we're going to talk about what's happening right now and what an important day this is to remember some things in your life. So, Wen, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
I accidentally pressed the wrong button.
Yeah. Hey, if that's the worst thing that happens during the broadcast, it will be great. So, not a problem at all. It's good to have you here today. And, before we started, you had mentioned, I didn't realize this, but this was a rather special day or important day to remember something that happened in China. So why don't you share a little bit about that as we get started?
Mm-hmm. So, today it's like the 36th anniversary of the Tiananmen Massacre. Wow. And I remember when it happened in China, I was in high school. And I really was clueless about what happened because all we saw on the Chinese TV were about how bad the students were. There were protests, and they were so bad that they attacked the citizens. They attacked the military, and we were shown dead bodies of the soldiers. Yeah. And we were told that the students killed the soldiers, right? And everything about the Tiananmen Massacre you hear in the Western world, we were not aware of any of them. I was naive. I was a teenager, right? I was naive. So I never saw that a government could lie. So I believed everything I saw on TV. But there were at least several incidents that I would never forget, that made me kind of suspicious about what happened in China. I think the first one was, the day after the Tiananmen Massacre, right? There was one day after school, I came home and I saw my dad sitting in front of the TV, and he was shouting to the TV. He said, you said no one died. And what about all those blood on the Tiananmen Square? And then the moment my dad saw me, he just stopped and he suddenly left. Yeah. And I just there clueless what happened, right? And then in school, I was in high school, the students, like us, right? We were required to write essays about the Tiananmen Massacre. We had to say, how bad the students were according to the requirement of the government. I remember I wrote
basically
essay.
you were basically told what to say, and then had to say it.
Yes. Basically, we had to write essays to kind of align to the government requirement. And I was one of the best students in the class, right? Of course, I wrote an essay. I said how bad the students were and everything.
Right.
And I remember my teacher, my language arts teacher, when he read about my essay, he had such a strange expression, very strange expression. It was not like usual. He would say, "Oh, good job," you are the best. But he had such a strange expression on his face. I couldn't tell what's going on because, obviously it was well written, but he was reluctant to say anything. And then that was the second incident. And the third incident was 1 year after the Tiananmen Massacre. I went to college. Once you go to college, right, you see students from all over China, and I was from a southern city. So, I never saw what happened in Beijing, but we had students from Beijing. In Beijing, everyone witnessed the Tiananmen Massacre.
Yeah.
So I remember there was once the girls, in the dorm, we gathered together, we ate, we chat, and we talked about randomly anything, right? And all of a sudden I came up with, the topic about students and something. I said, oh, those students on Tiananmen, they were so bad, they killed the soldiers. And I thought that was normal, right? But there were two students from Beijing, two girls, same age as me, and they had such a startled expression. They was and they look at each other and they look at me, and they had such a strange expression, but they did not say anything. The whole conversation just ended there. And I always wondered, after I came to the US, like what was that kind of strange expression, right?
Mm-hmm.
And after I came to the US, it was in the mid 90s. I still believe that students killed soldiers on the
Yeah.
Tiananmen massacre, right? And then until my American colleagues one day mentioned this to me. And there was one day, like, when we do experiments, right? Like you have a ton of time sitting in
Oh yeah.
the next step, you have 20 minutes to
Yeah.
do the next thing and another 20 minutes. And during those waiting time, right? Like we just chatted about anything. And there was once like my American colleagues, one was from Taiwan, the other is from the US. They said, how could your government be so bad? They killed students.
Yeah.
And I was so shocked. I said, no, my government did not kill students.
Right.
I said, those students were so bad, they killed the soldiers.
Yeah, let me show you the essay.
Because, yeah. and like they were so shocked. Like, how could you believe that? I said, that's your government propaganda.
Yeah.
I said, no, that was not propaganda. Like, that was true. If you say my government is bad, you're saying like Chinese are bad. You're
Right.
anti-China.
Yeah.
And like I burst into tears.
Oh wow.
Like, I was so emotional that my colleagues had to stop. They said,
Yeah.
okay, Wen, you need to read more. Like
Yeah.
look up like Tank Man, all these pictures and videos. And we saw the videos, we saw the pictures, right? I said, those are made by Hollywood. I said,
Yeah.
my government told me that Hollywood made a lot of
Oh, yeah.
propaganda against China, right?
Yeah, because they're
And that
against
was my
China.
response.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was very, very emotional. Like, and I remember I went back to my dorm, right? Like I was so emotional that I cried for a whole night, but and that was also the time I started to think, if everyone in the U.S. believes so, then maybe I should find out what happened. Although I was not willing to believe it, but I kind of feel like my American colleagues, they were my friends. We have known each other for many, many months. Like
Right.
they know me well, and they had no intention to hurt my feeling. And
Yeah.
I must find out what
why
happened.
would they, right? Why would they?
Yeah, why would they?
Yeah.
And then I kind of talked to other Chinese students on the campus, right? We have Chinese students from Beijing. And I remember I asked another Chinese student, and this is a boy. He's from Beijing, same year as me, right? And I asked him, like, did anyone die on Tiananmen? And he also looked at me with a strange expression, say, oh, you didn't know? Like, at least two of my, I took two students in my class died in Tiananmen. And I was so shocked, like, because that's already in the US, right? And he was not worried about telling me the truth, and he knew me well. Like we always we spend time together. We were in the same friend group, and I was so shocked. Like if that means indeed someone died on Tiananmen, and if my friend has two like someone two person he knew died, it must be many people died. Like
Right.
this is one case.
Yeah.
You have to think about there's so many people in Beijing. Many people died.
Right.
And that was really the beginning of my path to find out the truth. We say like truth will set you free.
Yeah.
That was a beginning for me to find out what's going on. What is the truth, right? And then that was the time I started to read about China, about the history, because the history I learned in China were all distorted, right?
Yes.
You all know the Great Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976.
Yeah.
And those 10 years, the Chinese government killed over 2 million intellectuals.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in
And,
China,
and who was it they were going after, and why?
yeah, we never heard anything about it. Like they said, oh, it's a Holocaust. It's sad. But nobody ever said who created this, who's responsible for this, right?
Right.
Like no one dared to ask, and no one wanted to ask. And I came to the US, I read about all this history. I realized my parents were also part of the victim groups because they were highly educated, and they were taken to the rural area, and they sacrificed a whole career. Although they survived, they lost everything, right? My father lost his health and his career. My mother also lost his career. She had to live as a single mom for like 10 years because she was separated from her husband.
Right.
And they were forced to work at two provinces. And I look at all this history, I was so shocked. I also learned how the Communist Party persecute individuals by punishing your family, right? If you ever say something wrong, they would punish your family. They also actively encourage Chinese to report each other to the authority, right? Like they encourage children to report their parents to the authority. Then they
Right.
would praise these children as a hero.
Yeah.
They would encourage friends to report each other to the authority to exchange for cash rewards, right?
Yeah.
They also, they would give prize in the public, like to praise how wonderful you are. You love the Chinese country, right?
Yeah.
Better than loving your friends and family.
Yeah. The
And that
state,
was
right?
why,
The
yeah,
government.
that was why my father would not tell me the truth. That
Yeah.
was why my Chinese teacher would not tell me the truth, even though they knew what happened in Beijing.
Yeah.
That was why my Chinese classmates, in China, in college, would not tell me the truth because they look at each other. They thought, okay, she's very pro CCP. If we tell the truth, she may report us
She'll probably
by
turn
to
us
the
in, and then
authority.
she'll get a reward, and she'll be even better praised. And yeah.
Yeah, that was so shocking after I came to the US. Like, I just feel like that was unbelievable. Like, I lived like this for
Yeah.
20 years.
Well, with the Cultural Revolution and with your parents, so you didn't really know. I mean, I remember you sharing like they had books, but they didn't really read them. Like you knew they were educated, but yet there was something. You always kind of knew there was something but you wouldn't have known then about what they went through when you were younger. And so this
Yeah,
is what you learned after. And the
I came.
Tiananmen Square was the thing that really that catalyst that kind of broke that truth, that brought the truth, that
Yeah,
brought that freedom to be able to explore and learn the
yeah.
history of what happened. And then, boy, that really had to really touch your heart for your parents, what they went through.
Yeah, but it's just sad. Like in many people who went through this, right? They thought they were not persecuted. They thought that was a norm. Like my parents still saw like they were not persecuted. Yes, they
Yeah,
were never thrown into prison or labor camp, right?
yeah,
But the whole China is a labor camp. Like they,
yeah,
my dad wanted to be a nuclear scientist. He was taken to a coal mine
yeah.
to
That's
dig
that's
coal.
quite a bit different.
You know, but he thought he was not persecuted because
Right?
everyone lived like this. We had to
Oh yeah.
follow the order of the CCP, of the Chinese Communist
For the
Party,
good
right?
of the state, for the good of the country, or whatever. Yeah, however
Yeah.
it's.
You
Yeah.
see, this is the most powerful part of the propaganda. They would twist your mind. They would twist your mind. Like they would make you think it's normal. It
Yeah.
was not persecution. So that they the authority can twist people's mind. Once you accept this ideology, this distorted logic,
Yeah.
and you would think everything the party did was right.
Yeah.
And if there's anything miserable, and that was your mistake,
Yeah.
what was your fault because you didn't follow the party's order. That was your
Or
own problem. That was not the party's
whatever
problem.
group the party decides they're going against at the time, it's their fault. Whatever. Yeah.
And I see that's the fundamental problem of all these atrocities um, in China and maybe in many other Communist Party countries. And if you want to break down this system, you have to first awake yourself
Yeah.
from this wrong logic. We call it like communism logic.
Yeah.
So to make you realize what's happening, like what is right, what is wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like, after I came to the US, I saw strangers smiling at each other. I saw like that was unbelievable.
Yeah. In
Because
public,
that
right?
they,
Yeah. Like they're
yeah,
grocery
and they
store
were
or
not
whatever.
afraid of each other
Yeah.
reporting to themselves, like to the authority, right? And
Yeah.
this is what we call freedom.
Yeah.
But in many countries, like China and North Korea, people never had this kind of freedom, and they couldn't imagine how life is with freedom.
Yeah, and
So
there's different
that was
ways that kind of spirit comes in. The thing we're talking about here is the communism that has infiltrated, China, taking over so much of it. But in other places, it's other names, but it kind of shows itself in the same way that oppression, basically making people into slaves, serving this government, this kind of force that's out there, not just destroying families. That is definitely a big thing. There's right and wrong. There's a culture of life and family and things that are good, and there's a culture of death that's out there, and one of destruction. And I mean, we see it manifest in different ways. Right? We see that with some of the attacks that were happening here in our country. Individuals saying "Free Palestine," and they're going to kill people that are innocent,
Oh no.
doing nothing
Yeah.
in order to. If something you're promoting, you have to kill other people, you have to destroy other people, you have to silence other people. There's probably something wrong with what you're doing and what you're supporting.
That's horrible. Just think about what's happening in Colorado, right?
Yeah.
What happened there. And I would say, if what shocked me the most 30 years ago, how I worked from the propaganda I received in China, that started my journey to become an advocate for human rights in China, to expose the Communist Party's lies.
Right.
But nowadays, I think, especially starting from the COVID time, right?
Yeah.
I was shocked again,
Yeah.
was how much influence the Chinese Communist Party has in the United States
Yeah.
during the COVID, right? I see the whole scientific field
Yeah.
bought out by the Chinese government. When we all see this virus, right, from Wuhan,
Right.
and it was so obvious, right? The pandemic started there, and they had a virus lab.
Right.
And at that time, I remember, it was February, right, 2020, before China denied that virus, it was from Wuhan. Most of the scientists in my circle believe
Right.
that, okay, something's going on with that lab, was likely a leak. And I was expecting the
Right.
Chinese government to say, oh, it was a leak, it's all the fault of this lab, it's not the Chinese government's fault. That was what I expected, because that was typical of the Communist Party,
Sure.
right? They would not take any
You
responsibility.
blame some
They would-
person group and you get rid of them, and we took care of the problem. It was them. Yeah.
Yeah. But what really shocked me was the government just completely denied the virus came from Wuhan. They said Americans brought it to Wuhan in this military, was a sports activity or something.
Well, like
They
an
said
attack or
Americans brought
something.
it to
some
Wuhan.
kind of-
Yeah, they said Americans made the virus and took it to Wuhan, which was ridiculous, right?
Right.
How could this be? But see, the scientists in the US accepted that. They accepted this kind of they say, oh, this virus is not from the lab, it's from bat. It's from animals, wild animals. But Wuhan
bat was
is
the big one.
2,000 kilometers from bats, right?
Yeah.
And Wuhan people, they don't eat bat. That's not part of Chinese cuisine.
Yeah.
And I see them lying like that, as if it was true. And I see people really believe that. They said science said so. Follow science. Believe science.
Well, that
Follow
was
who is science.
amazing
Right?
how much of the health community, scientific community, how much of educated people around actually weren't willing to admit some obvious things that a lot of people are like, wait, what? This doesn't quite make sense. This, and for so long too, right? It wasn't just a short amount of time. I mean, there were people that were literally shut down in our country, in America, because they didn't say the right thing, go the right direction, and that's a really scary thing in a country that's supposed to have freedoms.
Yeah, it was the most shocking moment. After I came to the US, it was in 2020, right? The spring of 2020, when I saw leading science journals openly had this statement signed by hundreds of top scientists say the virus is not from the lab. It came from nature.
Yeah.
That was in the spring of 2020.
Actually saying it's not even, that it wasn't even possible or something. It's not from that.
Yeah.
That's an incredible
They completely
statement.
denied the connection from the lab. I mean, to me, it's openly lying about it, because this lab has been doing gain of function research since 2015. Because I know that because they published a big article about it. And you can look at the article, and these top journals and scientists say this is not gain of function. I said, are you kidding me? This is not a gain of function. They make that virus able to infect mouse, right? If that's
What
not
else
gain
would you
of
call it,
function,
right?
yeah,
There's not another
I was
term.
so shocked, like because I see like these journalists, these scientists, they definitely know what's going on, but they openly denied it.
Yeah.
And the rest of the scientific community just followed this mainstream, so-called mainstream.
Right.
Because if you do not follow this mainstream
Yeah.
opinion,
Yeah.
you're going to lose your funding. You're
Yeah.
going to get backslashed by the whole community, and nobody
Right.
wants it to become a target.
Yeah.
So
And
this is
it
very, very
is
shocking.
a community when you get into some of the fields like that where you can be totally shut out. I mean, you can lose funding, ability to, whatever field you're in to even work in many ways. I mean, they can really shut you out, or they can reward you rather handsomely.
Yeah, I
If
know. I mean,
you,
you can be fired
yeah,
because of what you think, you believe, right? Like
yeah.
all people can do is like remain silent. If you're
Which,
not powerful enough to say something,
and that doesn't make sense in science, does it? In
it's just
science,
totally true, right?
yeah,
Because science, you're supposed to pursue the truth.
yeah,
You're supposed to. I was so shocked and was so disappointed because I chose this career to become a scientist. Because
right,
I saw like a scientist should be a very spiritual path. You pursue truth. You look at
sure,
the facts. You want to bring
absolutely,
truth to the world. And this is how much corruption I saw. I mean, during the pandemic, and then there was the election, right? Like
oh
I
yeah,
did some research about the voting machine, about everything, and I realized, okay, how much you can play with that, right?
yeah,
Because in 2016 election, Democrats said Republicans manipulated the election. They
yeah, yeah,
published many
yeah, oh
articles
yeah,
about how the voting machine can, switch
yeah,
the vote. And
yep,
I studied that those articles. I even wrote a summary about it.
yeah,
And I realized, like, okay, in 2016, Republicans said voting machines were not safe. And all of a
yeah,
sudden in 2020, they say they are 100% safe. There was
yeah,
zero fraud.
yeah. What
I
was
mean,
it?
this is
The
ridiculous as
Democrats
well,
said that,
right?
right? They said it wasn't secure, and then they said it was secure all of a sudden. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And all of a sudden, in 4 years, it became 100% secure.
yeah,
And I did not see anything happen in those 4 years to make them 100% secure.
yeah. What was the
And
fix?
like that can't be true, right? Like
Right,
anyone with a logic, like unless you have some very serious procedure, you
right,
have to fix the problem.
yeah,
Otherwise, you can't just all of a sudden say it's correct.
yeah.
It's everything's fine now.
Nothing,
That's not
nothing was
true.
done, and it works better.
Yeah. So I mean, I saw so many lies,
Wow.
serious lies, like on mainstream media, and I knew like in the past, everything's under the table. Now
Right.
everything's on top of the table. They can openly lie
Yeah.
without feeling anything wrong, and there are like a significant percentage of Americans would follow.
Yeah.
And if you don't follow their opinion, they say you're bad. You are like
Oh yeah. Yeah.
you're like crazy. You are like
You
a
don't know
conspiracy
science. You
theory.
don't whatever. Yeah. Just so many. Whatever. Anything. Yeah. Anything to tear you down.
I would say this is actually like a really, really shocking year, 2020, to
Yeah.
realize how much infiltration the Communist Party has in our world, like how much China has influence over the world. If they can change the scientific community, the mainstream, they can openly lie, they can openly spread the lie, the propaganda in the United States,
Yeah.
and they would not need to take any responsibility. And that was how I shifted my focus, right? Like, in the past, I saw, oh, everything I do, I
Right.
wanted to help Chinese people. I
Yes.
want to help people in my homeland.
Yes.
But now I'm thinking, actually, it's very important for me to save the US
Yes.
because this is where I live. This is where I raise my family.
Yeah.
And I don't want my children to live in a world without freedom. And I'm witnessing how our freedom is little by little is gone. Right?
Yeah. Well, and we saw a lot of that, right, with what happened then. You look at not only what was happening in the scientific community, but that also filtered into the whatever, all the social media, right? You had like even like what we're doing now. I'm broadcasting it on Facebook, YouTube. This conversation would have been shut down back then. A lot of that stuff was being filtered, and so that influence, that spiritual influence, is what I see it as. These systems that are set up was actually controlling the narrative. News medias. I guess we can use mainstream again, right?
They call it the mainstream.
There's this stream that these influences want to take us down and control the narrative, and they don't want people to look at the truth. They don't want to do investigation. They don't want to be revealed, right? They just want to keep it quiet, and all that. And I do see 2020, which, I think God has a sense of humor, seeing 2020 vision. It was a time of revealing a lot of these things. And I'm really thankful for the time we're in now, because I do believe more people are seeing things, and so thankful for you. You talked about, I think last time we were talking, that people say you're a whistleblower, and you're kind of more wanting to hand out whistles to everybody, to let everybody know, hey, we need to know truth. We need to walk in the truth and see these things, investigate, and I think we'd all be so much better to have freedom in our lives, and to be able to know the truth. So I talk to so many people, or meet so many people, and they think things, they believe things. We're talking about the Tiananmen Square massacre, as an example here, but they'll believe these different things, and I'm thinking, how do they believe this? But they've kept been told this, and they've been shown this, and to be able to explore and look at truth and have conversations, I think is so important.
Yeah, I mean, I came from a world I was 100% brainwashed, right? And I could awake, and I could see the truth, and I also feel like hopeful, for America, right? People, at least now you can hear different voices, and you still have opportunity away from those kind of propaganda. And speaking about the media, you talk about social media. It just reminded me about the mainstream media, especially about New York Times, right? Media like that. They have a long history, of good journalism, and they have many followers. But that was also the target of the Chinese Communist Party, right? If you can take over that mainstream media, right, then they can spread the propaganda, and then they can use their credibility to help Chinese authority, right? The New York Times, have quite a few articles about human rights in China, but they would focus on small problems, labor camps, Uyghurs, and they would say, okay, see, this is all about human rights in China, but they would not cover anything bigger. They would not want to say anything about the major groups persecuted in Falun Gong, in China, especially this group called Falun Gong, the spiritual practice. Chinese people do this meditation for better health, and about before 1999, about 70 million Chinese people practice meditation called Falun Gong. And nowadays, Falun Gong become the major victims of the persecution by the Chinese authority.
Yeah, I never
in a
hear
report
about
in
that.
2022, right? In the year of 2022, according to the U.S. State Department, 79% of dissidents detained in China were Falun Gong practitioners.
Wow.
So from Amnesty International, from United Nations, from U.S. State Department, every report in all the times indicated after 1999, Falun Gong is a major group persecuted by the Chinese government. If you look at the number, way more people in Falun Gong were persecuted than Uyghurs. But the New York Times really report about Falun Gong. Especially Falun Gong is a victim.
I never hear about it.
About the forced organ harvesting, right? The Chinese government took organs from them for transplant, because these are people doing meditation. They're very healthy.
Yeah.
And the Chinese government has a long history of taking organs from death row prisoners, right? They sentence young people to death and take their organ from hospitals.
Yeah, I remember looking at some of the numbers on some of that early stuff, and they'd say it was death row prisoners, but the amount of organs compared to how many death row prisoners there were, it was even from the beginning.
Like way more organ transplant than
there was
obviously
obviously,
can offer.
Reporting. How do you trust the reporting on a lot of that too? But yeah.
But like when we talk about Falun Gong, they suffer so much persecution, and they are also the most active group in China to speak against the infiltration. Right? The Communist Party's human rights. They developed softwares to help Chinese people to bypass the Great Firewall in China. They also started a big trend of human rights movement to help Chinese people to awake from the propaganda, and they started the trend of quitting the Communist Party. Right, the Chinese people can send a statement across the internet blockage and post it on the internet. Say, I want to quit the Communist Party. I want to quit the youth speak of the Communist Party or young pioneer of the Communist Party. Then they can get a digital certificate. Say, you quit the party. This is a serial number, right? And when these Chinese come to the U.S. and if he wants to become a U.S. citizen, and you have to submit this statement, say, I quit the Communist Party. Because as a Communist Party member, you are not supposed to be accepted as a U.S. citizen. Right? That's American law. Right. But like with this statement, you will be accepted because that's officially accepted by the U.S. government. And on that website, they already accumulate over 400 million statements in the past 20 years. So Falun Gong is an amazing group under such a brutal persecution. Right, like they are still speaking the truth and saving Chinese people from the propaganda, helping them to awake.
There are three pillars of truth. Remind us the three philosophies that they have.
So with all of this happening, right? But what is New York Times doing is like they rarely mention Falun Gong. They never talk about the human rights atrocities. They openly deny and say, oh, the organ harvest is not happening. Of course, they would not openly deny. They would interview someone, say, oh, this college professor said organ harvest is not happening. They would interview another famous person, say, oh, the organ harvest is not happening, right? They're very sneaky. And they never interview anyone believe that the organ harvest is happening.
They put out a statement,
media, right?
The official statement is no.
They would not mention that the U.S. Congress passed bills in the past several years. Every year they would pass a bill.
There was just a recent one, wasn't there?
In China. There was a recent one in May. The Congress passed 2 bills against forced organ harvest in China. But New York Times just would not mention that at all.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to pass a bill against something that's not happening, I guess, if you're...
It's just like, it's so shocking to see a major mainstream newspaper in the U.S. who can openly lie about the truth. Like they would, if the whole U.S. Congress passed a bill unanimously, right?
Yeah.
And the New York Times just simply not mention that.
Yeah.
And they would find some... someone they call specialists say, oh, it's not happening in China. They would call this news. This is ridiculous if you think about it. Like, how could a mainstream media say something like that? But they do have their followers, right? They are diehard readers of New York Times. They keep reading these kind of articles. And they would say, okay, everything the New York Times said is true. Then they would believe that. And this is also very big problem in the United States. A significant percentage of mainstream media are spreading the propaganda, and most of them have business ties with the Chinese government. Right, the Chinese government would pay them to run advertisement, in article formats. Right, some articles may be just directly supplied by the Chinese authority, and the Chinese government can also send people to work for this media. Right, some of them could have been the Communist Party members. Like some of the authors, if you look at their names, they have Chinese names. If you look at their background, they have families from China, or they have families with strong ties with business interests in China, right? And of course, once they start to work for the New York Times, they would write pro-China articles. Yep. The New York Times can always say, hey, we have balanced report. We interview 99% of our specialists who are pro-communist party. We interview 1% that's
Yep.
against the communist party, and then all you see is like 99%, right?
Yep.
This is the reality. They would say they would claim this is truth. They would claim this is news. This is just unbelievable to think about it. This is happening in the United States.
Yeah.
It's not much different if you look at these reports. What the New York Times is doing now. What is the difference between New York Times from the Chinese state TV? When the state TV in 1989 showed us, said like the Tiananmen massacre was about students killing soldiers,
Yeah.
right? New York Times is doing the same thing,
Yeah.
like the Chinese state media in 1989.
Yeah.
That was so shocking to me.
Yeah,
like this is in the United States,
It's
and
hard
this is
to
what we are
believe,
reading.
especially when you look into it and realize how much it is. It's really hard to believe how much influence there is, how much really kind of control of the narrative. There is.
Yeah, this is exactly really shocking. And I would say like one recent group rounds of attack of New York Times was a Chinese dissident group is attack towards Shenyun Performing Arts, and we briefly mentioned this before. So as I mentioned, the Chinese Communist Party destroyed the traditional Chinese culture during the Cultural Revolution. They killed over 2 million intellectuals and shut down the whole education system in China for 10 years so that Chinese people can no longer receive education and they can be easily brainwashed by the propaganda, right? This is the purpose. And then they realized, okay, for 10 years without a school, it did not work very well because that means, factory has no engineers and
Yeah, what happens when everything
hospitals has
starts
no
breaking down?
doctors,
And
right?
yeah.
And the economy broke down, right?
Yeah.
And then they say, okay, we have to stop this. We have to do this in a different way. So what happened after the Cultural Revolution was that the Chinese authority, the Communist Party, created another version of Chinese culture. They would use Chinese arts, Chinese music, Chinese dance to promote communism, right? Then they would like say, okay, this is Chinese culture, but this is all about communism. They would like you have dance, right? With swing swords, say this is great, Communist Party is great,
Yeah.
and they use that as like Chinese culture. And they not only spread that in China. Like when I was in China as a student in China, like everything I learned about the Chinese culture, Chinese, performing arts is about praising communism. So I was sick and tired of them. I was not interested at all.
Yeah.
And I came to the US. I saw all these Chinese performing arts companies coming to the US. They perform Chinese ballet, Chinese dance in top theaters. It was also all about praising Communist Party. And the Chinese government say this is Chinese culture, but in reality, those were communism propaganda, right?
Yeah.
And you cannot say they're wrong because once you say Communist Party is wrong, they say you're anti-China.
You're
against
China.
Chinese people.
Yeah.
And then, they will say you're anti-China, you're anti-Asia, you're Asian hate, you're racist.
You're racist.
And this is how the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, hide behind this superficial form, this distorted Chinese culture to protect themselves.
Yeah, so they co-opt the culture and just kind of take it over, basically.
Yeah, they took over Chinese culture and turned it into a propaganda tool.
Yeah.
And what really refreshed me was in 2006, 2007, when I first time saw Shenyun, right? Like I was so surprised because Shenyun is a dance company in New York. It's made in USA. So in 2006 or so, like a group of Falun Gong practitioners, they were dancers and musicians and artists. Like, that was their profession. They gathered in New York. They wanted to create a dance company for China before communism. So they want to show you the true Chinese culture, not the Communist Party's version.
Yeah.
So every year they would tour around the world. They would have like over 1 million audience each year. Like they tour to about 100 cities around the world every year. And they would show you China before communism, the authentic Chinese culture, without Communist Party's propaganda. And I really loved that because I think this is very important for the whole world to see the real Chinese culture. Once you see Shenyun, you immediately know the Chinese government stuff. They were communism. Those were fake. Well, of course, the Chinese government would not allow that. Right? Like
Yeah.
since the very beginning, the Chinese consulate embassies, they would call every theater and force them to cancel the contract with Shenyun. They say you cannot show Shenyun, otherwise you're going to
Right.
break the relationship with the Chinese government. You're not going to get any Chinese show again, right?
Yeah.
And that did not work very well in the US because Shenyun tickets sold really well. You know,
Yeah.
if a theater sells Shenyun, right, it's full house, the
Yeah.
theater gets a lot of income, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's good business.
Yeah.
While the
It's an
Chinese government
amazing
show,
show. Yeah. It's
yeah, and the
incredible.
Chinese government show, nobody wants to watch them.
Yeah.
Nobody likes those propaganda.
Right.
And like the theaters know Shenyun is great. They watch the Shenyun, they know it's great. But that strategy in other countries like South Korea, like
Oh yeah.
smaller country who strongly rely on business from China, that did work. And in quite a few countries, the theaters canceled the Shenyun shows. That caused quite some trouble. And also, the Chinese government started to attack the Shenyun tour bus. You know, the
Oh
dancers, right? They have
yeah.
tour bus. They would drive around the U.S.
Sure.
They would stop in different city, and
Yeah.
so the Chinese consulate, they have their agents in the United States. They also bribe some local people to attack the tour bus. They would cut the tires in the
Oh
night
yeah.
so that the tour bus would stop functioning. And that was why Shenyun had to have volunteers to monitor the tour bus all night, every
Yeah.
night, to make sure the strangers would not approach them. And nowadays, the Chinese authority also started to attack Shenyun using lawfare. You probably are familiar with lawfare.
Yeah.
After the past 4 years,
I think we're a lot of people are more familiar with it now.
yeah, lawfare. That means the Chinese authority, right? They have agents. They have their proxies here in the U.S. They would file lawsuits against Shenyun.
Oh
They would
yeah.
also look for people, those dancers who left Shenyun. Because every year Shenyun would train the most brilliant dancers,
Right.
and then every year they have assessment, right?
Yeah.
If you're not good enough, they will not be able to renew the contract with you. You will have to leave. And of course, every year some dancers, some musicians would have to leave because they
Right.
were not good enough, right? And it happens to all these top dance
Yeah.
companies, all
Yeah.
these top. If you think about Olympic and everything, right? You
Right.
have to. You were chosen to be the good one because you're the best one.
Yeah, when
And
you're
not
at
good
that
enough,
level,
leave.
you can't stay there for very long.
Exactly, right? And of course, you can look at all these people who could not stay, and some of them will have resentment. They say,
Absolutely.
it was not fair. Like I was good enough, but they didn't let me stay, right?
Yeah, people don't
And-
make it to that level without just a little bit of ego too. So
Yeah, and then the New York Times would look for, and these CCP agents, the New York Times would look for these people who were not good enough, and they would say, "Hey, do you want to write an article about your negative experience with
tell us how
Shenyun?
bad it was. Yeah.
Tell us how bad it was." Yes, the New York Times in the past year published at least 8 or 9 articles like this. They purposely interviewed dancers and musicians who were not good enough to stay and let them tell their story, how bad it was, how bad some of them completely distorted, because at least one of the musicians published a statement on X, and he was very, very upset after the interview by New York Times. He was not happy that he had to leave, but
Right.
he really wanted to stay. He said that was the best dance company. I want to stay with Shenyun, but I had to leave. It was a sad experience. But New York Times distorted his words, making it sounding as if Shenyun was such a bad experience, right? And so by this strategy, they were able to find some people who had resentment and take their words. We're talking about manipulating their words, right? You say 100 words, 99% say it was a great experience, but I was so sad, I had to leave.
Yeah.
And they would only take your last word. I was so sad about this experience, right?
I felt
And
like
this
they
is how
didn't do it properly. They could have done it differently or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So then they could publish articles, negative articles about it. And because it's New York Times, right? And then other mainstream media will also launch some articles like that, maybe publish similar articles.
Well,
And they also started to
And
recruit some of.
the fact that they published so many in such a short amount of time, is that really what's so newsworthy? That that doesn't seem balanced with other news that they would be reporting on. That shows you an agenda. That they would.
Definitely. And the reporter who wrote all these articles is a Chinese from a family with a very strong business tie in China. And his family, her family has been like openly praising the Chinese Communist Party. But after these were exposed, right, they wiped out all the websites that had published the history of her family. So you can see this agenda behind the scene, right? Obviously, the Chinese authority has an agenda, and they send this reporter to New York Times to write specifically this kind of articles
Yeah.
to demonize Shen Yun. And they are also having a lawfare, like I talk about lawfare, because when you talk to these former performers, Shen Yun, right? Some of them may not feel so good about their experience, right? They would file lawsuits against Shen Yun.
Right.
And you can see these people who never had much like a background. All of a sudden, they were able to find the best lawyers around the world.
Yeah.
Very, very expensive law firms
Mm-hmm.
to start lawsuits against Shen. And what kind of lawsuits they can file, right? Like you would say labor law. They would say Shen Yun used child labor. It was very interesting. Because if you think about professional dancers, right, they're like gymnasts.
Yeah.
You have to be young to be able to tumble, to fly, right?
Yeah.
If you're too old, you cannot tumble.
No.
And of course,
you don't
if
see
you think
many
about
elite gymnasts that are in their 40s.
exactly, if you look at a gymnast, Olympic champion, how old are they?
Yeah.
15, 14, right? 16.
Yeah.
And if you're over 18, they will say you're too old.
Yeah, you're done.
And nobody would say Olympians, they're child labor, right? They also have their commercial, ties, sponsors and everything. And nobody would say they're child labor, right?
Right.
But, they could file lawsuits against Shen Yun saying they use child labor because Shen Yun toured around the world. And some of the dancers, they were students, right? The students means like high school students, they were under 18. And they would say Shen Yun used child labor.
Right.
And they would file lawsuits. And you can think, okay, it shouldn't work, right?
Yeah,
Like this kind of lawsuits. But
so
they
does that
are.
mean, so every movie that has a child actor, that would be child labor, right? So every movie
Exactly.
needs to be sued.
This is just ridiculous, right? If you think a performing arts company use child labor, and especially this is like classical Chinese dance that require skills like gymnasts.
Yeah.
This is just ridiculous. But they're filing many, many lawsuits. And they have a ton of money to file these lawsuits. And if you have a ton of money, if you have enough connection, you can find, you can make it move through because
Right.
right? Like all these kind of things can happen.
Yeah, when it comes to the lawfare and using the legal system to attack people, oftentimes the process is the punishment. It doesn't really matter what happens with the lawsuit. It's just the fact that they have to hire lawyers, they have to go to court, they have to deal with all this stuff, and that's expensive and time-consuming and distracting and all of that. So a lot of times they don't even care what the outcome is. The outcome is just putting them through that. The goal.
Because by doing all this lawfare, right, like Shen Yun would have to spend a lot of money, a lot of energy to deal with these lawsuits. And at the same time, New York Times can publish more articles against Shen Yun. So this is just incredible to think about. This is happening in the United States.
Yeah.
This is not China. I'm feeling like this is becoming like China.
Yes.
You can see the government would persecute a group of peaceful people for just doing meditation. And now this government is persecuting these people in the United States, using their money, using their resources, using their connections with media and the legal system. Yeah. So this is, I think we really need to find out what's going on now, and we need to be.
Yeah, it's so important to know the truth, to know what's happening, to know that there are forces out there that are trying to manipulate us. They're trying to deceive us. Not only do we have that communist Chinese influence, but we have things like we talked about earlier. You got like Hamas and this idea of free Palestine, all these different things that are also carrying people down all these different paths and all these different ways that are just destructive, damaging to other people, all these different things. And it's so important for us to know the truth, to share the truth, to seek it, right? It doesn't just fall in your lap. You do have to do some seeking.
We also need to keep in mind, like this also pro-Hamas like force, like China is also a major part of it, right? I remember I saw one report, like 80% of weapons used by Hamas, like made by in China or something. So like China is also the major force of many, many problems around the world, including the Russia, Ukraine. Right? China is also the major sponsor of Russia. That's why we cannot sanction Russia, because they can bypass from China, right? Like they can buy everything from China. So when we talk about the Communist Party of China, not only they cause trouble in China, they cause trouble in the US, they're also causing trouble all over the world.
Yeah, Middle East.
And this is something we have.
And when that force is working and doing things, it's got goals, like getting the rare earth materials, all these different things, and getting the land, by military bases or whatever. There's definitely a goal. There's a plan. There's work being done. That's long-term goals that are working very effectively, and it takes individuals like you. Sharing the truth, individuals being willing to look at and say, wait, am I being deceived in some way? What areas do I need to look at a little more? Where did I notice some things that maybe weren't quite right and I need to investigate a little more?
Yeah, Dennis, I just feel like, I always feel like I'm insignificant, but anyone insignificant is your own responsibility to the society to find out the truth and to speak the truth. And this is how history is made, like by insignificant people. So I hope that is a good conclusion of our conversation today.
I think it's perfect, because ultimately, right, nobody's insignificant. We make a difference to the people around us, and whatever way we can to be able to not only to be able to know truth for ourselves, but to help share it with others, to help people to find freedom, right? And I think, one of the things we didn't hit on a lot, but the greater freedom you have now than what you had before when you were believing lies and stuff, and the freedom even to be able to explore and to learn new things and to find truth. Some of the things we learn aren't real pleasant, but as we learn truth and we're able to share and we're able to help, I think it adds so much to the world around us, creation. And I believe very strongly that we are created, and being part of what we are created to do is live and sharing life with others. And part of that is knowing the truth and sharing the truth. So thank you for all that you do.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm so glad to have this session on a very special day.
Yeah. Yes. And please, if those that listened, if you're not familiar with, look into what happened to me at Tiananmen Square. I think when I was young, the only image that I remember in America that was so strong was the one guy that had his groceries and was standing in front of the tank. But then that message in America was, some people stood up and they did good, and something's and never really knowing the reality that there were people that were massacred there, and those lies that were told. So thank you again for joining me, and I'm signing out. If you have any last word, go ahead now.
Thank you very much. This is a very special day.
Yeah.
I'm glad I could do a little bit for the Chinese people and my American friends.
Yeah. And if you don't have a whistle, pick one up and start blowing it. That's from our last one. Thank you, Wen.
Thank you.
I'm stopping the stream now, and we are going to be clear.